So as Tulu was saying, that's the traditional interpretation of the geological and archaeological evidence we have. And from a biblical perspective, creation scientists have the exact same facts and data to work with that they have. What's different is our worldview and our interpretation of the facts. Stones, artifacts don't come with pre-assigned labels saying what they are. You have to interpret the evidence. And so as Christians, as Bible believers, we believe that the Bible is absolutely true. And so we have to interpret the evidence with the Bible record in mind. Traditional secular science believes in evolution, believes that everything happened by chance, sprang into existence counter to the laws of physics 15 billion years ago, and that gradually became what it is now, that life somehow evolved from non-life with no evidence or proof or even a theory of how that could have happened. But they say that it has, because secular sciences have rejected the concept of God and creation, and therefore it had to have happened by chance. It had to have happened gradually over time, because if you don't believe in God, that's the only explanation. For those of us who believe in God, we believe that God created the world in 6 days, as the Bible says, and that there was an early civilization that grew up from Adam and Eve, and eventually just a couple generations removed from Adam and Eve, I believe the children of Cain and Abel, or maybe their grandchildren, were already developing metallurgy and music and that sort of thing. So ancient man was actually quite intelligent, and we don't really know what the technology of the pre-flood world would have been like, but they would have had a lot of technology. They lived over 900 years, so a person had a long time to learn and grow and develop and become very skilled in a lifetime of that long, and they could pass that knowledge on to their children and others. And so they probably had a lot of knowledge, a lot of education, a lot of skills that we just don't know about because we don't have that historical record. It was wiped out in the flood. So about 1,600 years after creation, I believe it was, maybe 1,700 years, God destroyed the earth with a flood. We had one family that survived the flood on the ark. That was Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. So after the flood, everyone would have known God, and everyone would have spoken one language, and they would have known the truth. And one of the things that's interesting is you'll see flood myths all over the world that share a lot in common with the biblical record of the flood. And the fact that all these diverse cultures all over the world have flood records of some sort lends credence to the fact of a flood. But shortly after that, the flood coming off the ark, they may have kept some records, some knowledge in books or something. We don't know what they actually had along those lines. But they would have been limited in how much knowledge and technology they had coming off the ark. And so as mankind started growing again, they were limited in their technology and what they could do. And one of the first things they did, a couple generations down from Noah and his sons, they were already rebelling. God had told them to spread out and fill the earth, and instead Nimrod led a rebellious effort to keep everyone in one location and build a tower leading up to heaven in Babylon, and they were already becoming idolaters. And so the rebellion against God starts all over again almost immediately. So the Bible says that God came down and confused their languages, because having a common language helped them to work together in fighting against God. So he confused their languages, and then different family groups did start spreading out. And in Genesis, I believe it's 11, there's what's called the Table of Nations. It might be Genesis 10. And you can actually trace a lot of those family names through history. In historical records, those names actually appear in different areas. So an alternate idea of why people were living in caves is, as they were spreading out and moving, they were natural shelters they could take advantage of. And one of the reasons we might have evidence of that is, well, caves don't go away, so those remains would be well preserved. It could be that they were living in tents and huts and other areas that we just weren't maintained over thousands of years. Therefore, what we have evidence of is the cave dwellings.
I would credit that very much.
And then the alternate explanations from some of the time scales and things, secular scientists believe that there were multiple ice ages over in multiple periods of time, but they have no explanation for how an ice age could form, because an ice age actually requires a hot ocean and cold continents, and they have no explanation for how that would occur. But following the flood, the Bible says that the oceans of the deep broke open, or the fountains of the deep broke open, so there were underwater volcanoes and a lot of plate tectonics. They believe the continents split open. One continent split into the current continents we have very rapidly, and magma and other hot lava came up into the oceans. That's where a lot of the moisture came from for the flood, and why it was able to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. And so that's where all that moisture came from, but it also heated up the oceans. So we have, following the Bible explanation, an explanation of how you get a hot ocean. Another thing that we know, even from Mount St. Helens and other modern volcanoes, is that they spew a lot of ash into the atmosphere, which then blocks out the sunlight and creates a cold climate on the land areas. So that would have created cold continents while we had a hot ocean, which would have led to a lot of snow, which then fell in northern climates and didn't melt, which would build up and create glaciers. And so that is the creationist and biblical explanation of how we had one ice age. And then in terms of some of the history and the time periods and things, the global flood would actually explain the geology of the earth a lot better than secular science, where they believe that fossils were formed over billions of years, or certainly millions of years, and that all these gradual layers built up. But it actually doesn't make sense in multiple ways. So one of the things we have is polystratic fossils, where you'll have a fossilized tree that goes up over
between two different,
well, which would go through what's considered millions of years of sediments, but that would be impossible because the top of the tree would have just rotted and disappeared. So that tree had to have been buried rapidly, which means all that sediment occurred very quickly in a short period of time, not slowly over millions of years. We also have the fact that fossils, to form a fossil, you actually have to have a rapid burial. And so if the sediments just built up gradually over time, then the animals or other organic matter would have been quickly consumed and rotted and disappeared and not fossilized. The fact that dinosaurs and other animals are often found in what are called graveyards, where they are torn apart and buried together in large quantities in areas, shows that they had a violent and catastrophic end, where they were probably buried due to the floodwaters rising and they couldn't escape, and so they all got washed up into one area and then buried rapidly. And there'll be fossil marine creatures and things in that same area, which speaks to the fact that the waters were coming from the ocean and pushing into the same areas and buried with them. In terms of a lot of the dating, the secular scientists would say that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, but recently they have found soft tissue inside fossilized dinosaur bones, which could not possibly have survived even more than, several thousand years ago, certainly not millions of years. Despite that finding, they cling to their belief that they're 65 million years ago. They now say, wow, who would have believed that this soft tissue could last 65 million years? So rather than following the obvious conclusion that it could not be possibly that old, they just reject that evidence because they are so devoted to their long age theories. Another evidence is carbon-14, which has a half-life of 5,730 years, and therefore, even if you had an organic sample that was 100% carbon-14, which doesn't happen, but if you did, it's still, every bit of the carbon-14 would have decayed within 100,000 years. So anything over 100,000 years old should not have any detectable carbon-14 in it. But carbon-14 has been found in diamonds, which are thought to be billions of years old. Carbon-14 has been found inside dinosaur fossils. And so, again, you have evidence that dinosaurs cannot possibly be that old. You also have cave paintings and rock paintings and sculptures of what looked very much like dinosaurs, so they had to have been during period times after the flood, where people actually lived with them and saw them. And so a lot of those dragon legends actually could have been speaking of interactions with dinosaurs and things like that. And the word dinosaur is only about 150 years old, so anything written before then would not have talked about dinosaurs. They called them dragons. So I think those are a lot of the facts and things. When it comes to old age timekeeping, they typically use uranium, lead, and argon type decay models, but those are filled with a lot of assumptions, like 100% of the original sample was parent material, and which they don't even explain how that's possible. But that's the assumption. There's the assumption that the decay rate hasn't changed over millions and billions of years, which might seem reasonable at the same time. There's no way to prove it. And there's also, you have to assume that nothing got moved in or moved out over all that time, despite groundwater and that sort of thing. They have dated, I think they dated rocks that were formed from Mount St. Helens erupting as being 3 million years old, even though it happened 30 years ago. So it shows that those methods are unreliable, and it's based on a lot of assumptions. And therefore, we should not feel intimidated by secular science. We should follow the Bible and what it teaches.